All right, looks like we're live. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming by. Um, I'm Professor McCoy, and joining me tonight is Sean Malone from Foundation for Economic Education. If you'd like to introduce yourself or say anything else.
I'm actually the creative director for FEE. I've been with FEE for about 4 years. I run a number of aspects of the organization, including all of our video production, audio, podcasts, and then, of course, I'm the creator of Out of Frame, a video essay series where we talk about the connection really between pop culture and philosophy and economics and that kind of thing. So I'm kind of excited to talk about free speech. It's one of the topics that I feel probably most passionately about and most strongly about, although I will preemptively say I'm not a lawyer. I know we are about to engage with a lot of discussion from a guy who is a lawyer and who's citing a lot of case law. I'm not going to be super competent to talk about that aspect of this, but certainly on the philosophy side and really on just talking about the merits of the ideas that we're discussing, I'm pretty excited about that. So,
Right, and yeah, likewise, and I'm a huge fan of the Out of Frame series, and in fact, it was kind of the idea. It was the China episode. Couple of China episodes that really gave me the idea to work through this talk in particular. So if we're ready, we'll go through it from the beginning, and YouTube lets us. But
yeah,
problem. Yeah. And this is we're going through a talk from Dr. Corey Brettschneider. And this is through my university, in fact, the University of South Florida. And he's talking about free speech, hate speech, what these things mean, and how we handle it here in the US, how it's handled elsewhere, say in Europe. And he has his own sort of proposal for how he thinks it should be handled from a legal standpoint, especially, which I think is very relevant to the kinds of things that we're seeing with online sort of soft power censorship through media companies and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Let's get into it.
I wish, of course, I could be with you in person, but wonderful to be with you all virtually. And thank you for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be in the company of such great speakers. And I've spent the day talking to students in classes and about the issues that we're about to engage in. And it's really been fruitful, engaging discussion. So I'll welcome your comments. I'm going to begin by laying out two views that predominate throughout the world. One, the approach of the United States. One, the approach of pretty much every other liberal democracy outside the United States. And then what I'm going to do is suggest that both the dominant approaches fall short, and I'm going to try to make the argument for a third approach that, as you just heard, is a vision of value democracy and an idea in particular of democratic persuasion within it. So let's get to it. The first approach, the approach of the United States, is really unique. And I think that when it comes to understanding not just the doctrine, which we're going to go in depth and talk about, but the philosophy of the United States approach to free speech, it's sensible to think, sometimes political theorists in particular think about utopias or ideals, but it's helpful to think of the kind of fear of a society gone wrong. And I think our approach to free speech in the United States, and when I say ours, I mean the current jurisprudence in particular of the Supreme Court, is a fear of what I call an invasive state. A state in which police cars are driving around outside our homes, listening in to kind of imagine what is it that people are saying inside, to spy on conversations, looking for wrong viewpoints. That might not just be an issue in which the state gets it wrong, as John Stuart Mill famously said, but it would have a chilling effect on our freedom of conscience. And so in the United States, we have a vast jurisprudence when it comes to the protection of free speech. Pretty much all opinions, or to use the court's term, all viewpoints are protected except for direct threats or speech directed at imminent violence. But the rest of the world has a very different approach. Even though in the United States, heinous things like Holocaust denial, membership in the Nazi Party, those things are protected speech in the United States. In the rest of the world, they are criminalized. And the rest of the world, instead of worrying about an invasive state, worries about what I call a hateful society, a society in which free speech enables anti-democratic viewpoints to predominate, such that they come to take over the society. And the worry about a hateful society is that ultimately it could lead, as Weimar Germany did lead, to a collapse of not just democratic values, but democratic institutions. And so the rest of the world criminalizes Holocaust denial.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I listened to this bit of this before we started the show, and one of the things that I wanted to mention real quick is that, Weimar didn't collapse because of free speech, right? Weimar collapsed because of hyperinflation, because of a policy, we can get into the whole history of the foreign policy that led to this in World War I and reparations being paid to the rest of Europe and other parts of the world. But the reality is it collapsed into a state of complete social unrest because its economy collapsed. Mm-hmm. The free speech aspect of it, I'm sure he's really, hinting at the rise of Hitler and all of those kinds of things. And I appreciate that. But at the same time, Hitler did not have a majority when he came to power. He did not persuade the entirety of everybody. The whole society was crumbling at this point because, it had printed trillions of Deutschmarks and completely destroyed its currency and destroyed its economy. So I don't know. I listened to this before and I thought it was kind of a weird choice of an example. And I know how it ties into other stuff. He's going to talk about Nazis and Nazi speech and that kind of stuff. So I get that aspect of it. But at the same time, I did want to flag that because I thought it was a weird choice right up front because it's not actually a free speech problem.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things about this too that kind of environment that creates a hotbed for the kinds of speech that can lead to political violence, and that isn't necessarily always going to be the case wherever we are in our current society. And even if it is, what's to say that restrictions on speech like that are even going to be effective in stopping this kind of thing?
And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more of this later, but there's an episode about Frame that's not actually out yet on the social dilemma, the documentary about Netflix and social media companies. There's actually 2 episodes that I'm releasing back to back. But one of the interesting things in that documentary is it kind of tries to make the case that just free speech, open, unencumbered speech, and you mentioned sort of the soft power of social media companies, but also, the way that we're interacting with China, I think, is another piece of this too. But part of the point that I make is that the social dilemma sort of pitches this idea that, like, well, if you just allow free speech, everybody will just go down this conspiracy theory rabbit hole or what have you, and except what I think I've actually seen is much more the case that when you restrict speech, when you boot people from these platforms, where you force them into smaller, more extreme groups, that's actually where you get the weirder problems. It's where you try to restrict their conversation, and then it ends up being, the mainstream people over here, and then the fringe group over here, and that fringe group just gets more and more and more ensconced in whatever it happens to be. So I'm already a little skeptical of the idea that if you just banned, speech from the Nazi Party in the 1910s and 20s, whatever, you would have had, you'd have a different outcome. I actually suspect that that's not the case.
When you see speech restricted like this, in large part, it just gets pushed into its own little isolated corners to turn into the kind of monster you don't want it to turn into. Whereas in open dialogue, you can have people who are de-radicalized.
Right.
And that's what you see with the mass exoduses from Twitter, things like Facebook, to other platforms.
Yeah. I definitely want to get into that later, but let's not, we can.
One of the things that I think is relevant right here as well is I think Dr. Brettschneider represents the kind of mentality that forgets that the state is not always under our control, whoever we happen to be. And that he's proposing a lot of these solutions, which I think can very, very easily be turned around against him. We see examples of this throughout.
What he said at the beginning too is this idea of sort of looking at this from a perspective of fear of government rolling down the street in sort of vans spying on people. But the first second I heard that, I was like, yeah, they do that already. So that's actually not a weird radical fear. That is exactly what the NSA does all the time, even in the United States. So it's kind of strange. Now, obviously, they're looking for, terrorists, or they're looking for things like that, and maybe not looking for somebody just saying the wrong thing. But you could easily turn that power to that end. Like, it would not be hard for any of the NSA's wiretapping programs to be shifted, or this, all of those kinds of things to be shifted towards that end.
Yeah, once the power is there, it's hard to get rid of it, or impossible maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just weird in sort of a post Edward Snowden world that we don't just instinctively recognize that might be not hypothetical. That's not really it's like, no, that's a thing that can be and is done already. So
yeah, absolutely. I think another to my knowledge, and I could be mistaken about this, but I believe Dr. Brettschneider has done some legal work in opposition to things like the Patriot Act. And so it's good for him for doing so. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's odd that he doesn't see that kind of a connection. I think it kind of comes back to this, this assumption that we can just get the right people in charge and then things will all
Mhm.
turn out okay.
Yeah.
Whereas it's not always or almost ever the case.
No. Yeah.
So let's keep going.
Yeah.
In Germany, in particular, membership in the Nazi Party. In France, they criminalized disparagement of Islam, and the actress Brigitte Bardot was prosecuted under that criminal statute. The rest of the world has an approach that is commonly referred to as militant democracy. The idea is protect expression, yes, but when it comes to threats to democracy itself, government has to defend itself from the kind of fascistic takeover that happened in Weimar. Now, what I'm going to offer is, and I'm going to say more about these two approaches, but what I'm going to offer is really a third approach, which I call value democracy. And the approach is simple. It suggests that while it is right in a democracy to protect all viewpoints from criminalization, that if we are going to have such a robust protection of free speech, government ought to speak out in order to criticize some hateful viewpoints that do threaten the hateful society, that do threaten democracy. And government does that, and we can see how that can be done by distinguishing between government in its coercive capacities and government in its expressive capacities. Of course, when it comes to the criminal law, I'll say there are rights against government to say what we wish, even if our opinions are hateful or heinous. But at the same time, government, when it acts as a speaker, I'm going to talk about license plate laws, when it acts as an educator, I'm going to talk about curricula in civics classes throughout the country, and when it acts as a funder of private organizations, should really use those funds, use that government speech to condemn hate speech. So my thesis tonight is that yes, hateful viewpoints, I'm going to specify what I mean by that, are protected from criminalization, but they should also be simultaneously condemned by government acting in its expressive capacities. I'm a political theorist, but I'm also a constitutional.
I'm gonna pause there for a moment because what do you think of this dichotomy he sets up between the government acting as a coercer and the government acting on its own as a speech, making its own speech acts? Or
It's a real thin line. I mean, that's something else that worried me when I first started listening to this. And now, to be fair, I've gotten past this point. Now I haven't, just for the audience, I haven't watched the whole thing yet. So we're going to get to a point fairly soon where I'm out and it'll all be new to me. But I kind of know where he's going. When I first heard some of these lines, my instinct was just to be like, whoa, no, let's not go this direction. Although I do think he tempers it as he goes forward. There are some things that I think I can find more of an argument towards. I don't want to sort of get too far ahead of ourselves, but he talks about things like license plates or whatever. And I'm largely okay with what he's about to say about license plates. But that said, when you start telling me that the government needs to speak out and take specific stances on different points of view and different, kinds of whether or not this ideology is okay or that ideology is okay, it's a real dangerous line. It gets us really into this territory. And I don't know if this is perfectly apt, but like the establishment of a religion, or the establishment of a set of ideas or whatever. I mean, that's really what the establishment of religion is in the First Amendment, is not about, ultimately it's now sort of seen as the separation of church and state, but what it was actually about was not having the Church of England or a church that the government defines as this is the right way to view the world, right? And then, obviously there's coercive and criminal aspects of that too, but I think there's also such a thing as a bully pulpit, right? Like, and I think that aspect of it is, if maybe not equally dangerous, it's still not without risk in any kind of stretch. So I don't know. I'm already like my hackles are up a little bit when he starts talking about this kind of stuff. I'm like, eesh, and I think to your point too, he's assuming from the standpoint of like, my friends, the people who believe the things that I think are right, are going to use the government to establish the right viewpoints. And they're going to emphasize that we all and all of us in the government agree with these correct viewpoints. Well, what happens when you have a person? I mean, I don't want to judge too much, but I'm going to assume he's not a Trump fan, for example.
He gets into that explicitly near the end too.
So assuming that, right? Like, what if Trump decides to use the government to establish, I believe in this, or I believe in that, or the government agrees with this position? I don't know. Again, it's a dangerous place to be already.
Yeah, yeah, I think so, absolutely. And then, I mean, we also have the issue of say, the funding of the government, right? And what that amounts to. From what I've gathered,
so is there a non-coercive aspect of anything the government does, right? Like, I think that's a really important question too.
Yeah, and if you're a social contractarian, then that kind of means that the government is the voice of the people, and so we're in this weird space of, well, the voice of the people is speaking out now against certain people that it's claiming to represent, or it's its own separate institution.
We may have immediately stumbled on the problems with the social contract theory, but
yeah, and that might be a bigger issue as well. But
but it's true though. I mean, this is definitely an issue, because once you say that the government is by the people, right, and you say that the government is representing the people, the minute that you establish that as your claim about what government is, then you really get into trouble immediately when you start saying, yes, but those people over there, we don't represent them, we don't like them, they're bad people. Like, they're still citizens, right? So you're either representing, and of course it's not actually possible to represent all people, and this is where we will get into nuance aspects of this that I do think are very, very challenging. But like, at the same time, you're right. You can't say we're the voice of the people and then absolutely deny, the validity of some of those people's viewpoints. It is immediately contradictory.
Yeah, it's if you want to take it far enough, and maybe this might be too far theoretically, see what you think. It's almost a kind of it almost amounts to a kind of compelled speech, that if the state represents the people, and then this, because the state is if nothing else extracting wealth from people who speak out against them, that seems like it's something like compelling people to speak out against themselves. Which is
well, and that could get us down the road of because I've heard for many years there's a handful of people out there who really, believe, frankly, all evidence to the contrary, that money buys elections, and that they want to take money out of politics. And I always ask people, like, what would you do instead? Because of course, campaigns still need to pay for, print materials and airtime and graphic designers and video producers, people who do what I do. They have to pay for us to actually make content for their campaigns. And they say, oh, well, the government would fund that. But at that point, what you're saying is, taxpayers like myself are now coerced to pay for a candidate that I don't even support necessarily. And then we have to develop a system for, like, which of these candidates rises to the level of allowing the state funding to go to them. It's an inherently bad situation that can really only be avoided by simply not doing that, right? Like, do not allow the state to fund that. And I think that this theme, for me at least, will probably come back up over and over again, because I think a lot of the actual answers to some of these problems are get the state out of the entire situation. And then, it becomes not so much of an issue at that point. Or, it becomes a different issue that we have to deal with, but it's at least a non-coercive issue.
Right, it's a non-coercive issue, and we don't have the same kinds of unintended consequences that might wind up worse, or it might wind up creating different problems, or
right.
A lawyer, and it makes sense to get clear on the meaning of hate speech and hateful viewpoints in the jurisprudence in the United States. And the most important case on this topic is a case called Virginia versus Black. And in Virginia versus Black, the court really defined our contemporary law of free speech, and hate speech in particular, by distinguishing between two sets of cases, two kinds of hate speech. In the first kind, there was a fight earlier in the day, and two individuals named Omara and Black burned across the street from an African-American family. And what the court, rightly in my opinion, said about that cross burning is, even though these two individuals claimed they had a free speech right to do it, the court said, this is a hateful threat. It is the equivalent of saying, I'm going to come attack you or even harm you later today. And it's not protected speech, that kind of hateful threat. So when it comes to what the court calls true threats, or I'm calling hateful threats, There is no protected speech. That is right. So that's not the domain that we're really going to focus on. But more controversially, what the court said in a second case, when the Ku Klux Klan burnt a cross on a field during a protest, during a rally, I should say, in which they disparaged Jews, disparaged African Americans, said the ideology of the Klan, which is really opposed to the idea of equality under law in the manner of the Equal Protection Clause. The court said that kind of hateful viewpoint, that opinion, is protected. It wasn't a direct threat like the other case, and the court agreed to protect it. I think that that is right so far as it goes. But if we're going to have that kind of protection of a Klan rally like that, government needs to do more to send the message that the Klan is not protected for their reasons, but protected for reasons that they actually reject. Protected for democratic reasons that are at odds with the Klan's ideology. That is a logic that's exposed in the case itself, in Justice O'Connor's opinion, in what I regard as the most important work in political theory, in democratic theory about free speech, Alexander Mickeljohn's Free Speech and its Relation to Self-Government. And I'm going to say something about those two texts before going on to talk about what I think the right additional thing to do to clarify the meaning of hate speech in our democracy is, to clarify why, yes, it should be protected, but also condemned. What O'Connor said is that the Klan, she began with history. The Klan in its foundation in the 19th century is opposed to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, an amendment and a clause not just a part of our Constitution, but that really rewrote the Constitution from one that was consistent with slavery, that allowed the enslavement of individuals, to one that outlawed not just that heinous practice, but that demanded equality under law, non-subordination. And the Klan is founded in opposition to that idea. And so what O'Connor really shows us is the Klan is not protected for their reasons. Their reasons are opposed to the Constitution. They, after all, wouldn't protect the free speech rights of African Americans, of Jews. Their ideology is at odds with the very reasons why we protect them. But that is sometimes lost, that contradiction between the protection of the Klan and the underlying reasons for their protection. It's brought out, I think, by the philosophy of Alexander Mickeljohn, who asked that we all imagine ourselves in a New England town meeting. And for those of you who don't know, I know that you're in Florida right now, but in the northern end of the country, the other end, there's meetings take place where individuals make decisions within direct democracy. So if the town wants to decide, are we going to build a bridge on the north side of town or the south side of town, everyone will opine, their opinions will be heard, and then there'll be a vote in the end. Mickeljohn says, imagine that the moderator of the meeting, who's just supposed to keep order and call on people, says, I'm going to disallow some viewpoints. I'm not going to let the people in favor of building the bridge on the north side of town speak, for instance. That kind of censorship, Mickeljohn says, wouldn't just be bad for speakers or limit expression. It would undermine the legitimacy of the meeting itself. The people in that meeting couldn't be said to be democratic citizens who had access not just to make arguments, but to hear all arguments so that they could then, in turn, as democratic citizens, make decisions. Now, what Mickeljohn turned that metaphor to do is to criticize the practice of prosecuting leftist speech, communist speech, anarchist speech, which was very common at the time that he's writing in the early 20th century. After all, Eugene Debs, the Bernie Sanders of his time, who runs as a socialist candidate, was in prison for his views. That's the treatment that that dissenting leftist speech received at the time. And Mickeljohn's point is he was no leftist, but he said, even as a moderate, I can see that banning those views undermines democracy, so it has to be protected. But at the same time, what I think has gotten lost sometimes in the court's jurisprudence is that somehow the protection of all viewpoints, the protection of the Klan, has come with an understanding, Justice Jackson says this at one point, that no opinion is correct or that every opinion has an equal place in America. And that's actually just wrong. The Ku Klux Klan rejects the reasons of Mickeljohn, the reasons of O'Connor and Virginia versus Black. They reject, after all, the very Equal Protection Clause that's foundational to our democracy. They reject the modern understanding of the Free Speech Clause as extending, regardless of race or religion, certainly. And so they are at odds with the very reasons why they are protected. So some regard that as a paradox. As you've heard me say, I don't. I think we can get out of it in the following way. We have to distinguish between.
Before he gets into that, I think so far, this is one of the big parts where I think he has a solid point.
Yeah, I agree.
That there are people who are protected by a system that they oppose, that sort of thing. And we can talk about, the hate groups that he's talking about in the past. So think people like Klan. We can talk about, socialists and communists to some degree as well, who would oppose the right to free speech, commerce, and all these things too. The next part, though, I think the question of what to do about that becomes difficult, and I think he didn't say this yet. He mentions the idea of a liberal as being the kind of person who cannot take their own side in an argument, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, I think really the only problem with that is kind of like we've been saying, that there is the implicit assumption that the state, those in charge of it, are always going to be on the same side.
This comes up a fair bit in comments that I field on YouTube, actually, on a lot of any of the Out of Frame episodes I get into. that deal with free speech as a primary subject, or even sort of touch on it, I often get, because I try very hard, especially through episodes of that series, to really strongly make the case, to some extent, that was just made here, which is that you have people who are illiberal and who would not abide by the same rules, or indeed support the same rules that I would want society to have, right? I want a completely free and open society in every conceivable way. And yet you're often dealing with people who vehemently disagree with that, either, or frankly, quite often both. People, I think, sometimes forget that fascists and nationalist socialist type of folks are indeed still socialists. They're still people who really heavily depend on the state to control the economy, to control the culture, to control all of the aspects of society. It is not limited to just speech or to issues of racism and those kinds of things. I mean, it's really a total control kind of situation, and I'm wildly opposed to this. And I mean, this is not super brave to say that anybody's opposed to those kinds of things, but the reality is that I think people don't think a lot of these things through very carefully. And what is a challenge, and what I get criticism for, is saying, and yet, even though I vehemently oppose this, and I do absolutely recognize that if many of these kinds of groups of people were able to capture power, they would not afford me the same liberties as I am advocating for them. And yet I still think it's incredibly important to advocate for those freedoms to be universally applied, precisely because of what Brettschneider said earlier about being in a room, and you are doing a disservice to, and in fact, completely discrediting the process, right? You're discrediting the process of discovery that free speech is really about. It's not, we have to recognize that none of us has all of the answers about everything. And although there are many ideas that I certainly consider incredibly terrible and pretty easily demonstrably terrible, right? I don't take it for granted that I am right inherently, and that I am so right that no discussion is even worth having.
Right.
I actually also think that you're doing a disservice to people who have not yet heard counter arguments, who have not yet wrapped their brains around some of these problems. Because if you don't allow people to hear it, then you also don't allow people to discuss and debate and then shut it down intellectually, right? All you're doing is saying, well, this is not allowable. We don't.
Yeah, that's actually
like
something that something that I'll run through in class, even with my students, is trying to come up with counter arguments to obviously wrong positions.
Yeah.
A lot of my students struggle, at least at first, will really struggle to come up with counter arguments to.
They don't have to.
The nationalism of National Socialism, for example.
They're never called on. They're never called on to do that, right? Like that's, and I find that to be really fascinating. Like there are certain things that we hold to be sort of self-evidently false, right? Or just self-evidently immoral or bad, and a lot of those things, if you actually ask people to articulate the reasons why these things are terrible, they can't do it because they've never had to before. Just everybody in their entire lives have always just said, this is bad, this is wrong, this is a terrible idea, full stop. Don't even talk about it at this point. There's no sense in even debating it. It doesn't matter. I find that to be a really weird position. I also find it to be maybe more dangerous in some ways than certainly than allowing, let's say Nazis or whatever to speak, because a Nazi, like you're not ever going to stamp that out completely, right? There's always going to be some people somewhere who believe terrible things, collectivist beliefs about other races, other cultures, or, just in general want to, be totalitarian in one way or another. You're never going to stop that. But if your society is not capable of understanding why those things are wrong, that's where you're really going to have problems. Because again, you're not going to get everybody's not just going to be on board and excited about it. You're also going to have a lot of support from people who just don't know any better and who don't have a way out to counter argument, to counter some of those arguments. And I don't know how you get there unless you allow a full range of expression. I really don't, because I think the biggest issue for me for free speech is the epistemic humility aspect of it. It's that none of us has all the answers to everything. And by challenging each other, by expressing viewpoints and then knocking them against each other, that's how we get closer and closer to reality and truth over time.
Yeah, and I think it also, about getting closer to reality and truth. It's not like, who was it he quoted? Oliver Wendell Holmes, I think it was, saying that something along the lines of that there is no settled truth of the matter, and so we shouldn't settle down on one side or the other. I think that, like you're saying, the defense of free speech is almost completely the opposite. It's that there is a truth of the matter. It's just that, on my own, I'm incompetent to figure all of it out. And so we've got to work together, and a lot of that involves intellectual conflict.
Yeah, I think it's really important. So I think most people at this point, I think, are relatively familiar with the idea of cognitive biases and things like that affect the way that you perceive the world in ways that bias you towards things that may or may not be accurate, right? We all struggle with these things. We all see, first of all, we all only have a tiny piece of the total sum of knowledge in the world. So we're only seeing and perceiving what we see, what we experience, what we've read, that's the only thing we have to go on. But that doesn't mean it's the totality of what exists. And so what's really great about putting yourself in an environment where you get to clash against other people's experiences and knowledge and perspective is that now you suddenly get to see what pieces are missing from your own viewpoints, right? And you get to see what pieces, actually don't stand up very well. You get to see where the evidence that you think is true about something really isn't true, or where your argument is actually weak, and where you can't, like you were talking about with your students, where you go into an argument going, well, this is obviously true. And then somebody says, well, why? And you go, I don't know.
Just cause.
Just cause, right?
Everyone knows, right?
Yeah, but just cause is a terrible argument. And you know that. We all know that.
Yeah.
So at some point,
and it's not going to convince the people who think otherwise. Yeah. And it's not going to bring them back into sanity, assuming that we're all sane, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a thing that I've dealt with a lot through these kinds of conversations on YouTube as well. It's a lot of people who are dismissive of other viewpoints, especially the ones that they think are really terrible, and saying, well, that person is just a waste of time. I'll never talk to that person. I'll never convince them. And I often say, why not? Why can't you convince them? And I'm not facetious about that. I have done this for long enough to have convinced a lot of people about things that they did not previously believe, and also changed my own mind about a handful of things, not the direction we're talking about, but the reality is that it's possible to do, and you can get better at it with a large number of people. Not everybody, of course, but there are ways to do it. But you're never going to do it if you have not engaged seriously with their position, and I think it's interesting because there's another facet to this too, which is what I think there's a little bit of this sense I get from people who really want to limit people's speech, that other people are not strong-willed enough, or they're not smart enough to be able to hear an idea that is a bad idea and not just immediately accept it. And again, I'll reference the social dilemma again on this point, because it is a big aspect of that film, where it sort of assumes that nobody really has any agency. It assumes that if I advertise to you something on Facebook, you'll just accept whatever it is I say without any kind of question or consideration for anything else, and that you'll just do what I want you to do. In fact, one of the people, Shoshana Zuboff, one of the people in the film, who was a former Harvard Business School professor, which kind of breaks my brain a little bit, literally says, this is what, essentially Facebook advertising is what businesses have always dreamed of, a guarantee that if you advertise something, that ad will be successful. I run ads, plenty of ads. it's not even close, right? Like the
That sounds like
reality
she's
is,
just reading for Facebook's marketing department.
yeah,
That's
right. It kind of does.
yeah.
Except for in reality, it's less than 1% click through on ads
Mhm.
on Facebook on average to begin with, first of all. And click through is just somebody visited your page or your website or whatever. Has no bearing on whether or not they've actually bought into your ideas in the case of fee, because we're essentially communicating ideas. We're not really selling products so much. But it, obviously doesn't mean that you just every page you click on, you're like, oh, well, there's a kayak. I have to buy the kayak now. Like, that's not how any of this works.
Right.
There
I
is
mean, if it
tremendous.
did, I mean, you can look at the number of ads on your wall on Facebook. It's something like
Yeah,
every 3 to 6 posts. And if I
yeah, they're
purchased
everywhere.
everything there,
And you
I'm an
skip.
adjunct professor. I can't do that.
But the reality is, and we all know this actually. I mean, we skip all of that stuff
Yeah.
all day long. We zip by ad after ad after ad. And the reason I think this is relevant to this conversation is because fundamentally, when somebody is trying to be persuasive about a viewpoint, let's say Richard Spencer or somebody like that
Mhm.
wants to persuade me that some kind of ethno-state nationalism is a better approach to a liberal than, a better approach to running a society than having a liberal democracy, or a more sort of libertarian world, which is kind of what I would prefer. But let's imagine that somebody comes to me and says, I want to persuade you of this. There's no real difference between that and somebody saying, I want to persuade you to buy this toothbrush or that, Coca-Cola over Pepsi or whatever. Fundamentally, it's somebody who is marshaling arguments, marshaling emotional appeals, marshaling
Mhm.
whatever they can to try to persuade me to do a different thing or to believe a different thing than I believed before. And yet, once again, I scroll by all this all day long. And it's not hard for me to say, disagree, don't want that,
Right.
and I'm perfectly capable of doing that. I genuinely believe the vast majority of people are perfectly capable of doing that. I think the data bears this out. I think if this worked, you would actually see a completely different world, And also, what's especially weird about it too is that there's also competing viewpoints happening all the time. So everybody's trying to marshal their arguments and emotional appeals to persuade you one way or another about everything. If you were really that susceptible, you'd just be flip-flopping all day.
Right.
You
And I
just,
mean,
oh, I'm here now, I'm here now.
especially
I'm a socialist, I'm a communist now, I'm a radical conservative now, I'm a communitarian now, I'm a nationalist, whatever, right? It wouldn't make any sense.
yeah. And I
Like
mean, especially
that's
looking now at like the fact checking things, that the banner that goes under just about everything you see on like your social media. Um, in fact, I've been gradually tailoring my ad blocker in my browser to get rid of a lot of those. Um,
smart.
it shortens the timeline if nothing else. Um, but even if you don't do it digitally, you can do it mentally. You don't see it,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
or if you do this, it has this assumption that even just seeing it there is going to immediately persuade somebody of not the view of what's being posted, but the view of the fact checker. Right?
yeah.
I think that's
I,
it's a very dim view of fellow
it
human beings.
It is, and it's also there is some, and I forgive me, I'm usually a little bit better about remembering this kind of stuff, but there is some evidence from psychology that there is a little bit of a backfire effect on those things. I remember reading, this is a number of years ago. I read some study that suggested that, and it was in a communications kind of setting, talking about um, not fully stating the arguments of your opponents in your persuasive argument, because it can sometimes backfire and find these moments of actually persuading the opposite way. I don't know how common that is, but it would not surprise me to find, a not small percentage of people who look at those fact checks and then immediately go the other direction,
Mhm.
because the fact checks themselves come with baggage. They come with context, and the fact that I know, and that most people know, that Facebook is not neutrally selecting which articles to fact check.
Right.
The fact checks themselves are not necessarily reputable, or there are all kinds of reasons why I might disagree with the way that a fact check has come to my attention. And if I am using that as a heuristic and I disagree with, and I think already I disagree with Facebook, there's a strong possibility that I will look at the fact check and go, oh, well, the thing must be right, and just flip it around and say, well, okay, fact check, that's them trying to force me not to believe this thing.
Yeah, and it can just, if maybe at worst, maybe the worst case scenario of this is it just sort of turns into a kind of intellectual tribal marker. Yeah. Where it just pushes the people who are already on one side further onto that side, and the people who are on another side further onto the other side.
I suspect that's largely true, especially in the more political stuff. I mean, that tends to be how that works. The tribalism tends to work that way anyway. I mean, we do have, speaking of backfire effect, we got like Brandon Nyan's idea of the backfire effect in political messaging, which is really that like you can actually, by presenting your arguments, dissuade somebody and push them literally to do the opposite of what you are trying to get them to do, mostly because people have a tendency, going back to the cognitive bias thing, tendency to reject arguments that challenge their sense of identity. If something is perceived as an attack on your personal identity in one way or another, which politics now for most people is a piece of that, right? Whether or not you're a Democrat or a Republican or whatever is now, might as well be the same as saying you're a good person or you're a bad person, or, and once you feel that attack, you're not listening to somebody at that point. You're not right. Carefully analyzing what they're saying and accepting it as if they're somebody who you care about and respect. That, by the way, is also, I think, a pretty important aspect of persuasion is somebody telling you that you're wrong about something. The only way I've ever seen that not really backfire is if the person that is doing the telling is somebody that the listener, that the recipient cares about and respects deeply, but I don't respect the Facebook fact checker, like I don't care, right? Like that person doesn't mean anything to me. If one of my best friends sits me down and says, I think you're wrong about this, I'm going to say, well, you care about me. I care about you. I care about our relationship. I will listen to you now. But if you go, you're wrong about this random person on the internet, I don't think anybody cares. So and I think it's weird. That aspect is odd.
Yeah. And it works on the assumption, I think, that this whole value democracy idea, it kind of works on the assumption that those doing the correction, whether that's the state or whether that's social media or what have you, are reputable universally.
Right.
That's, I think, pretty obviously not the case. He talks about how polarized and divided we are as a country, as a world, as what have you.
Yeah.
Let's keep going and see how far.
Yeah. When the government is acting as a coercer, as using its criminal law, in that instance, I agree with the approach of the United States, protect all viewpoints. And when it's sending its own messages. So take a recent case of the Supreme Court involving the Texas Department of Motor Vehicles. It's called Texas DMV versus Walker. And in that case, a group called the Confederate Sons wanted to place a specialty license plates on some cars in Texas, on their cars, that would use the Texas emblem and would also have the Confederate battle flag, what's sometimes called the Dixie flag, together with it. And the Texas DMV said, no. It's one thing to have a bumper sticker or to have your own beliefs that you advertise in your home or elsewhere on your car, but if you have the imprimatur, if you have the brand of the state of Texas, you can't mix it with what we regard as a hateful image. And they rejected that specialty plate. The Supreme Court agreed with the Texas DMV in saying when government sends its own message, when it speaks, it doesn't have to be neutral between all views. It doesn't have to protect all views equally. And that's exactly the idea that I'm trying to get across, that you don't want to allow government to be complicit in hate speech. In fact, it has an obligation to condemn it, as the Texas DMV did in rejecting that plate. There are other examples, I think, easy examples where you can see that distinction between government as a user of criminal law and as an expressor of values. Think of public holidays. We have rightly a national holiday celebrating Martin Luther King's efforts as a leader in the civil rights movement, working to correct the American apartheid segregation that was defined by Plessy versus Ferguson, overturned in the Brown case that said separate is not equal, inherently unequal, overturned separate but equal, and worked to spread that idea through legislation in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We celebrate that idea. We don't celebrate as an equal the idea of Bull Connor, the brutal Southern segregationalist. We don't think that government can't take its own side. Robert Frost is supposed to have said a liberal is a person who can't take his own side in an argument. I haven't seen evidence that he actually said it, but I'm certainly saying that liberal democracy needs to take its own side, and public holidays are an example of that. When we teach
This kind of comes back to what we were talking about as well. Like, even in a case like that, if his ideas had been implemented during the time of Martin Luther King's protests, right, it would have been implemented against the very ideology that he's forward and that he's wanting to defend and that he's rightly praising.
It's definitely an area where his assumption that the government will always take the right side of these kinds of debates, it doesn't hold up. I mean, certainly, you know, I mean, you can go back
during segregation, right?
No, it didn't during segregation. It didn't during, Jim Crow or slavery or prior to, suffrage. I mean, there are all these things. I mean, suffrage is probably a pretty good example too, because there were huge protests from women demanding, voting rights and all that kind of stuff. And yet people in power saying, no, this is a terrible idea. Right. And for a long time, and this is always the case.
If I'm not mistaken, it was framed as a kind of protecting our democracy, right? A vote for households and all of that, right?
Yeah.
And so you can use a lot of the same justifications that we see here.
You absolutely can, but it takes, and one of the things that I think people, I often wish people saw more, and I happen to, because of the work that I do and the work that I've done for the last 10 years or so, I've been fortunate, I think, to see the behind the scenes of social change in a handful of different areas. Criminal justice reform being one of the really big ones, where I've worked in that space a little bit over the past 10 years or so, and been around a lot of people who work consistently in that space this whole time. And one of the things that's always it's sort of equal parts like amusing to me and also a little bit enraging, is that when a big reform bill passes, a politician gets credit for it. So if somebody gets pardoned, or if we have something like the reduction of mandatory minimums or something like that, or even in some cases, friends of mine at the Institute for Justice have worked in different states on civil asset forfeiture for a number of years, and then occasionally you'll get a state that agrees that civil asset forfeiture is bad, and they will pass legislation to prevent that from being used. But then the politicians get all this credit for it, and you put a marker in time that says 2012, this politician stopped civil asset forfeiture. What you don't see is the 15 or 20 years or whatever leading up to that point, where groups like the Institute for Justice or Families Against Mandatory Minimums, whatever, were working on that problem, trying to persuade people, trying to change minds in order to get to a point where there was there was enough political capital on their side to change the position. And until they did that, the government would have sided the other way every time. Mm-hmm. And you can see this with gay rights. You can see this with civil rights and the African Americans and women's suffrage. You can see this across the board with the various struggles for increasing liberty for different people around the country or around the world. The government will be the last thing in that chain to change. And so
all past 50% plus one, because that's what it's after. Yeah.
Right. So when it's 49, right?
Yeah.
And you're telling me that the government has a duty to positively express a viewpoint. Well, its viewpoint is not going to be the one that you want.
Right.
And I said earlier, I'm sympathetic to the idea that you put a license plate on a state. The license plates are a state-run thing, and it's an expression, and the state fundamentally gets to decide whatever it wants on that. I mean, it's not. First of all, it's mandatory. I have no choice but to put a license plate on my car, so I'm already playing by their rules just to begin with. And then from there, they could decide that it's only numeric sequences, or it's only a sequence of letters, or if they allow customized plates, it can only be these rules. I don't have a lot to say about that negatively, because
right.
It's their game,
Yeah, it's the difference between a license plate and a bumper sticker. right? You can
Yeah.
have a bumper sticker like saying anything that you want about, even if you wanted it to be about your license plate or something.
Right.
But it's when it starts going the other direction that can get complicated. If it starts to actively promote something, and then
Right. And I generally think that bumper stickers, or sorry, license plates, I tend to treat that as the license plate is actually still owned by the state to a large extent. Like, that's kind of how I view it. It's not really mine. I wouldn't have put it on my car if I wasn't required to. Like, there are all of those kinds of things that I think, like, okay, the state is requiring this. And to that end, I think you made a really important point and an important distinction, which is the state is not imposing, the state is not saying, here's the customized plate you must put on your car. They're just saying, this is a customized plate that we won't print, and they're the ones with the printing press.
Yeah.
Probably in a prison somewhere, unfortunately. But yeah. Anyway, speaking of criminal justice reform, but
right.
But yeah, those kinds of things I don't have much to say about. But I know he'll get into this in a minute. Is when you start teaching history a certain way, or one way or another, and that's a different story, because now you're presenting facts about the world and you're deliberately omitting certain aspects to tell a narrative. I don't trust the government to do that without a lot of negative unintended consequences. And I don't have any reason to believe that there aren't those consequences, because every time governments have chosen what history to teach or what lessons to teach, it's fairly self-serving. It's not for the greater good. It's not because this is the right side of history and the wrong side of history. It's because this said what we wanted it to say, and that made our government look better, or our people look better. You're getting into really, really bad territory there, really, really quick.
So before we keep going, how much longer do you think you've got for us to keep going?
I can do a little bit longer, maybe
Okay.
15 minutes or so.
All right. Let's keep going here then, and then we might want to skip ahead to near the end. He has some Q&A stuff that I think it really puts ahead on some of the stuff we've been talking about. So let's keep going.
African-American history, Black History Month, and I think certainly there should be more than a month, and many places do have much more than a month. The curricula is not neutral. It takes the side of the civil rights movement in saying, rightly, as you heard in the introduction, that this mass protest is a denial of the idea of separate but equal, a demand for equality under law, a rejection of white supremacy. We don't teach it as there were the Southern segregationists on the one hand and the civil rights movement on the other. We rightly teach it as a realization of this promise of equal protection of the law. There are some cases that are very controversial, and my guess is that people will have a lot of questions about them, and I am going to talk as well about university speech, not just state speech. But I want to say something about some of the controversial cases as we get deeper into this, now that you've seen my view. When it comes to government funding, 501c3 grants, nonprofits, tax deductible status. If I give a private donation to a nonprofit, I get a break on my taxes. It's a kind of indirect subsidy. During the Nixon administration,
I can't let that slip. The assumption, of course, being that if it's yours and it's not taken, it's a subsidy.
That is frustrating.
Yeah,
that is such a common claim, and it's so bizarre to me. It rests on the assumption that the state owns everything,
right,
all the time. If it allows you to keep some of your money, it's giving you that money.
Yeah. And in that case, it kind of comes back to the point of well, then there isn't much of a problem with compelled speech, is there? Because it's the state doing it anyway. So.
Yeah, and any speech you are allowed to engage in is by your privilege, granted by the state, the benevolence of our leaders, right?
Yeah, and if nothing else, that's a bit of a slippery slope, I would think, and that can give rise to justifications for reaping restrictions. Well,
and also on the nonprofit side too. I mean, we saw, a few years ago, the IRS expressly targeting groups, in particular at the time, conservative groups, to deny their nonprofit status because the administration did not, it was essentially political targeting, right? that's when you start getting into that territory and saying, well, some nonprofits are allowed to do this, or we're going to make nonprofit status contingent on the kind of speech you engage in. Again, now you're actually into the coercive area, because now you're really saying, like, this thing is something that you are or are not allowed to do, even if you meet all of the standard requirements for being a nonprofit. I don't know. The nonprofit thing is also weird anyway, because there's a lot of compelled speech or restricted speech inside that anyway, with respect to campaigns and lobbying and things of that nature. And it's kind of a weird beast, but
and I mean, the power to tax is coercive, right? The power to tax, the power to destroy. And
yeah.
if you sort of flip the script, then it's saying that, okay, these particular acts of speech are permitted, as in 501c3, and these other ones are well, being perfectly straightforward about it, again, flipping it over, is they're punished in a sense by being taxed for being an organization that does such and such, as opposed to an organization.
And to do that, and to do that based on philosophical or political viewpoint is precisely why the First Amendment exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the First Amendment fundamentally exists as a check on the state's power to punish people for disagreeing with the state, right? And the kind of thing he's getting into is the same line of reasoning. It's the state saying, well, I can punish you if you don't speak the way that I want you to speak, if you don't believe the same things, that if you criticize us, for example. I just, states shouldn't have that kind of power. And I do think that a lot of that, again, and coming back to something I said at the beginning, a lot of that will be avoided or should be avoided by getting the state out of all of this entirely. Nonprofit status is a weird one, because it is like a lot of things in sort of corporate law, it's a creation of policy, and it's not something inherent to anything. I mean, you can always form an organization and do whatever you want, but the state has created these systems, and we operate inside those rules. I don't know. I've thought a lot. This is maybe a much longer conversation. Nonprofit law is strange, and I don't fully understand it, even though I've been working for nonprofits for a long time.
I can imagine. I mean, similarly to the issue of to what extent is social media censorship or fact checking or what have you. To what extent is that coercive? To what extent is that compelled speech or restricted speech? Or that also becomes complicated with being private entities with government connections, but then also something like, if not monopolies, something like monopsonies, I think would be, I guess, the term.
Well, monopsony is a single buyer. Monopoly is
it's
not really so monopoly.
Tight oligopolies with lots of barriers to entry, if nothing else.
Oligopoly with lots of barriers to entry, I think, is probably the right way to describe it. Because I'm always not comfortable saying monopolies, because there's clearly competition across a number of different lines. And then until what people do when they say like Facebook is a monopoly is they say, well, there's no other service that is exactly perfectly like Facebook. I'm like, yeah, that's the point of competition.
It's a monopoly on the platform of Facebook.
It's a monopoly on the platform of Facebook. Right.
Which,
just like I have a monopoly on the platform of fee.org, which is great, but like that's not really a monopoly. But I think describing them as an oligopoly to a large extent, I think makes sense, because there is a sort of a monolithic approach to speech and to censorship across most of the major platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, Instagram's owned by Facebook, so that's kind of the same thing anyway.
Google is a larger ecosystem as well.
Google has a larger ecosystem for sure. And so, Facebook. Yeah, absolutely.
Parallel to Facebook, a parent company of YouTube, et cetera, right?
Yeah. So I think those kinds of things are, I think they're deeply worth criticizing, which is why I do it a lot, actually. But I think that, a lot of the other stuff that we've been talking about, super, super dangerous to allow the government to step in and take even more control. Because again, now we're going from something that's sort of quasi coercive, or something that's not good. I don't even, it's hard to even quite call it coercive, because you sign terms of service agreements and everything else, but
difficult to practically avoid, or something like that.
Yeah, and then you're going to a system where it is very literally coercive, and you're saying, well, now the state is involved, and now you're entering the power of taxation, the power of jail. I want to stay as far away from that as possible, but that doesn't mean that you can't criticize the platforms for their approach to these things, and I think we should.
Yeah.
Anyway, maybe we skip ahead, or I don't know if you had something.
There's a couple of things near the end. Let me see if I can find exactly where I was thinking of, particularly where they talk about things like critical theory and having to do with the kind of denial of objectivity and things like that, which I think might give us some good material to wrap up on. I think it's right around here. Let me see if I can find exactly where it is.
By the amount of hateful speech that came forward over the last couple of years, and I think
it's not quite there.
Unbelievably dangerous. It's a really warping of that neutralist idea that I was talking about. Government, when it's putting people in prison, that's a particular thing that.
Actually, yeah, let's go with this.
And condemn it and try to transform it.
Okay,
great answer. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm surprised by how many academics and progressives were so surprised by the amount of hateful speech that came forward over the last couple of years, and I think in some ways sort of unprepared for it. Both theoretically and practically, and at the dinner table, with family and that sort of thing. Very.
I mean, in that symposium, it's like I'll never forget it. There's that sentence in the Brooklyn Law Review. If people want to go find it, one of the critics, is a pretty famous scholar of free speech, says this is a non-problem. There is no longer an issue of explicit white supremacy in this country, and people believe that. And I didn't believe it, but now you really can't believe it, I think.
Right, exactly. Another audience member wants to go back to what we briefly touched on, which is social media. And you see social media being used in all different ways to sort of deal with this issue and also promote, in every way around this issue. Do you think then that these social media companies should play an activist role in monitoring and, monitoring and making judgments about what's posted?
See if it matches. Yeah.
I'm gonna go with he thinks they should.
I bet you're right.
Zuckerberg, he said that it's impossible to discern truth from untruth. I think that's absurd. The Holocaust happened. There is climate change. QAnon is a nutty conspiracy not based in fact. Right. And the idea that you can't distinguish truth from falsity is itself unbelievably dangerous. It's a really warping of that neutralist idea that I was talking about. Government, when it's putting people in prison, that's a particular thing that it's doing. It comes at a high cost. That's the reason why democracy requires that we don't do that. That's very different than allowing stuff on your platform that is, way outside the bounds of reasonable. But I do also think that there's something to be said for, either that argument that you don't have to give it a platform, or what I'm more sympathetic to is the @Jack argument, the Twitter way of doing it, which is that you allow it, but you label it. I think that's in many ways more effective, that it doesn't suppress it, it allows people to see it, but then it also gets the message out that this is hateful or this is false.
Yeah, and
so this is the kind of thing where I was saying can get into something like coerced speech, because say I share something from Fee that has a fact check label on it, that given the fact that I'm sharing it, I tend to agree with the things that I share, not all the time, but most of the time, and then disagree with the little label across the bottom that Facebook, or I'm not really on Twitter, but whichever, whatever kind of label they place on it. That's, in a sense, it's kind of piggybacking on my speech to say their own thing, and that seems maybe not coercive, but certainly a kind of parasitism of speech, if nothing else, right?
Yeah, and it's super paternalistic. I mean, it's really pretentious, and it's companies saying, I'm smarter than you are, I know better than you, I know better than your friends, we will tell you what is true or what is false. By the way, Zuckerberg is actually right about that. Facebook cannot determine what is true or false. He was, I think, in the hearings that he's referring to, was speaking about the technological ability to discern truth from false, truth from falsity.
Algorithmically, right?
Algorithmically, yeah. And I want to be super, super clear about this. It can't. Algorithms cannot determine, because they can't determine meaning, right? So this happens, like an algorithm can't determine sarcasm, for example.
Right. Which is why the Babylon Bee is constantly being fact-checked, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, and Fee doesn't, not to, be too specific about your example, but Fee doesn't get those kinds of fact-check warnings a ton. But we did actually get one the other week, and and it rubbed me the wrong way because there was nothing wrong with the article itself. There was nothing factually inaccurate about the article. It was really kind of responding to the headline, but even the headline wasn't really inaccurate. It was just not the perspective that the fact checker preferred, basically. Which I think again gets to that point of like, do you really trust the fact checkers, and how does that work? But the other thing I want to say is I've had a number of posts over the last few years, especially, get these sort of warning labels. Quite often, they are ones where I am writing, because the way that I use Facebook is I try to use Facebook to spark a lot of lengthy conversation and discussion. Over the years, I've had things that I have shared that I have vehemently disagreed with, the content that I am sharing. And I have written lengthy posts, framing the thing that I was sharing by saying, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is a thing that I want to talk about right now, and these are things that I disagree with about this post. And then Facebook helpfully shows up to say, well, this is not, I don't need Facebook's help doing that. Right? What I wanted to do was spark a conversation around something that I thought was interesting, and that was an interesting fodder for maybe a broader discussion about free speech, for example.
Maybe
because
it's interestingly wrong.
I agree. It doesn't mean I agree with the post.
Right. And there's lots of things that are interestingly wrong and worth discussing, but this kind of no, this is not worth looking at. This is just something to disregard. That's kind of, if nothing else, it's chilling the kind of conversations that could pop up, because it's the same thing as, well, we don't have to pay attention to it, meaning that we don't really have to reconcile with it.
Exactly. And I think that this is a lot of the reason why, going back to some stuff we talked about really way at the very, very beginning, it's why people leave these platforms. It's why people move to Parler, or they move to MeWe or whatever. And I'm not opposed to that. But what I think is a concern I have, I would say, is that the more the mainstream platforms do things like fact checking everybody's post, or, actually some of the ones that really anger me a little bit more is putting the photo, sort of the blurred,
the filter over it. Yeah.
Like, you're not allowed to see this. You have to click in here to confirm that you wanted to see this. I wanted to see it. And I wanted to see it because I followed all of these people, and I want to see their posts. And if they post interesting things, if they post terrible things, I will unfollow them. And I'm happy to make that decision myself. I don't need Facebook defining that. But I think ultimately it starts to piss people off. And the more this happens, and especially the more it feels to people, regardless of how true it is, and I do think there is truth to it, that a lot of the fact checking is politically motivated, or it's one-sided, or it's not even. It's not like, Paul Krugman's posts are getting fact checked all day long, and although they should be probably. But when that happens, people who have a perspective that keeps getting flagged, basically, they leave. And when they leave, it means more bubbles, and tighter epistemic bubbles, and more isolation between different points of view, less overlap, more tribalism, right? The platforms themselves, doing exactly what Brettschneider is talking about, are fomenting exactly the kind of tribalism that I think ultimately he would like to avoid. And it's something that I've observed for the last several years. Before Facebook started doing that, it was really just cancel culture doing it. It was people hounding people and harassing people to leave different platforms, or making
also the tendency to block, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think seeing the number of people who, and by the way, how quick people are to block. I mean, people, I block almost no one, and I've maintained that policy for the last 14 years or whatever I've been on Facebook, and it's actually, it serves me really well. It's weird because you end up with a lot of, I have a pretty wide range of viewpoints that get represented, and that includes some of the tails. It includes the fringe ends on some of these things, but I like that better than blocking these viewpoints, A, because I want to know that they exist. And I want to know the full range of people's views, and I want to be able to discuss them with people and debate. But also because I am very concerned about the idea of creating a bubble for myself.
Right.
You know,
Right.
I really, the last thing that I want is to surround myself only with those people who agree with me. For all those reasons I said before. I mean, I don't have perfect knowledge about the world. I'm missing pieces. And I know I'm missing pieces. So I want everybody else to bring me their pieces. And I'm going to have to sort through them. I'm going to have to figure out whether or not they're things I actually believe or want to incorporate into my viewpoint or whatever. But like, it's only me who's going to be able to do that. Like, I don't trust anyone else to do that for me. They can't, you know? So I think it's really important.
I'll even say, even to the extent that you do, because I mean, we all have people we trust to get knowledge from,
Sure.
even just implicitly or as a default, right? But I think it's obviously important that we choose who those people are as well, like who it is that we actually trust, and that those relationships can develop rather than the anonymous fact checker or the platform itself or the government, as the case might be.
Yeah. And these platforms, again, I talk about this in the Social Dilemma that's episode of Out of Frame that's coming out, but the platforms do not have a very good history of being consistent about these things. They don't have a very good history of in 2012 they were running Facebook was running experiments to see whether or not they could sort of manipulate people's news feeds with really negative posts in some groups' feeds and really positive posts in other feeds, just to see if they could control people's behavior and change their mood, right? They didn't tell anybody they were running these experiments. They just did it, And in 2016, there was a big sort of issue with the trending news stories on Facebook. I don't know if you remember this. It kind of got buried in people's memories, but Facebook got in trouble because it came out from a Gizmodo article that all the trending news stories was coming up on the side of your feed that seemed to be
that was all curated by Facebook.
It was all curated by individual people, which already initiates a serious question of like, what are those people's biases? If it's not the algorithm just saying these are the most popular 10 stories that are being shared right now, and it is in fact a small group of individual employees at Facebook deciding which ones, well, what are their criterion? And it came out through a lot of the reporting there that they were actively suppressing conservative viewpoints, that they were choosing sources that were, the New York Times and Huffington Post, not, the Wall Street Journal or Daily Caller or whatever, And so those kinds of things are pretty interesting because you have a bad history already of these companies playing games with, but they can't be neutral. When you have human beings making these choices, whether or not they're at the algorithm level or they're deliberately, directly choosing which things you see, they're never going to be neutral. It's always going to be a product of the people who are writing the code or people who are going to be making the choices, So I just, the more we get into this territory, the more this idea of who decides really becomes important. And I don't get the sense that Brettschneider has really grappled with that much.
Yeah, very much so. And I think I think it's either the next thing we say, or I'm gonna have to skip ahead a minute or two, because it really hits that nail in particular right on the head. We can probably end with that. So
that's very consistent with your core argument, right? Which is you want to preserve the. All right, this one, oh my goodness, this one looks technical. Dr. Brettschneider, you have mentioned you see your theory as a third model of First Amendment jurisprudence to save our jurisprudence. This assertion, however, assumes that it needs saving. Why does the first thing? Do you think that academics and intellectuals bear any...
Okay, this is the one. Let me see if I can get to this point.
Baseball for one professor to another. But I, came of age during the whole sort of deconstruction postmodernist movement in academia, where the whole mission of a lot of academics was to sort of challenge the canonical truths about, what is true and all that sort of thing. Do you think that academics and intellectuals bear any responsibility for this sort of insane level of relativism that we're facing now, or do you think it has to do with bigger forces than that?
Boy, now you're really getting me to call out my colleagues. I definitely do. I mean, I think it's a travesty that that happened. I think it came of a kind of boredom of the time that things were relatively stable and that play was prioritized above all things. It was seen as a sort of fun rebellion. And when you're living in the world that we're living in now, it's not a good look. And I have a lot of friends who were part of that and participated in it, some who still do. And I think, wow, if you were disparaging truth, look at who your ally is. It's the guy in the White House.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so the irony I see in this is Donald Trump's recent decision to employ exactly the tactics recommended by Dr. Brettschneider, of keeping particularly postmodern critical theorists out of state positions and government jobs and all of that sort of thing, and out of curricula, and precisely where the government has control. And don't want to put words in his mouth, but I would guess that he is pretty fundamentally opposed to that.
But he is too. But again, like we were talking about, I think it doesn't occur to him, it doesn't appear to occur to him that there could be people in power who use the exact arguments that he's using from a perspective that he doesn't share. Mm-hmm. And I think I mean, honestly, like this is, I get this a little bit from Eric Eisenberg as well, and we haven't heard him talk too much, but like there was something he said earlier kind of stuck out to me, which was just that this idea of sort of us as progressives. He's kind of outing himself as saying like, well, we're very progressive individuals. We're all surprised. All my friends are surprised that all of this speech that we don't like has come out of Facebook or, whatever on social media. And it's just, it's interesting because it just feels like there's this, again, talking about these epistemic bubbles and saying like, this is a world that these two inhabit that they have not exited in a long time. And so now it's surprising when things happen that don't fit their model of like, this is what everybody agrees is good. Everybody I know agrees that these are the right things. These are the true things, and we'll just decide for everyone that they're allowed to see it or hear it or not. And then Trump, of course, disagrees with I don't know what Trump actually believes anyway, but he's using that same tactic to say like, well, you won't be allowed to hear this kind of viewpoint or that kind of viewpoint because I've decided that this is good and this is bad. And
or the state isn't going to be saying it, or your state employees aren't going to be saying it.
Yeah.
Kind of we have something similar in Florida too with our Governor Ron DeSantis. There is a huge controversy right now with what a lot of people are labeling a anti-protest bill or something like that. Which has a lot to do with, at least from my understanding, things like if public employees, if state employees are found to be participating in violent protests, that they were susceptible to losing their state jobs, which is very precisely this kind of methodology, but certainly not the side that would be. That he thinks is sort of the natural one to be in charge, right?
Now, to be clear about it, because I do think this is actually an important distinction. Are they themselves being violent, or do they just happen to be at protests where violence occurs?
I'm not 100% certain on that, but I think that an arrest at the protest is required for it to kick in. But again, I could be mistaken about that. I don't know all of the details.
Those are kinds of things where that's sort of the line for me, right? In general, with speech, and the line is violence, right? The line is converting your speech into physical harm against other people, right? And so I don't want to say I support a specific bill because I have no idea what it is, but
right, and I don't even know enough about it to know whether I specifically support
it. But
it.
I do think it's interesting because it can be. I mean, certainly something like that could easily be very chilling because it then disincentivizes people to go to those kinds of protests or to go to any kind of protest that might happen. So but again, I want to be fairly nuanced about that. I also don't think that if you are a violent person who goes out and beats people up, that necessarily you should be, you should expect to just have a wonderful time everywhere else. I think the other thing that I want to say, maybe just to kind of wrap this up on the postmodernist side, is I agree actually with them. I think postmodernism, to the extent that it's been applied in particular to metaphysics, I guess I will say. I actually have a fairly specific view of postmodernism. I don't have a problem with it in art, because I think it's actually fairly useful, not only to deconstruct things, but also to allow people. I came out of film and film music in particular, and one of the things that postmodernism did for film music is remove the barriers to selecting styles of music from anywhere you wanted to get the effect that you wanted. That is a different question, though, than saying there's no truth. In fact, it's sort of the opposite in a lot of ways, because while there is no right or wrong way to create music, there is still objective reality, even in the context of music. So, for example, if I want to convey to somebody using music a certain place and time, like I want to convey the American South in the 1850s, and I use some Dixieland, the sort of Dixie fiddle music, right? That will convey to you the feeling that I want. But if I use music from Uganda, it won't convey that. Objectively, you will not get that, because your cultural understanding does not include Ugandan, folk music in the American South in 1850, right? It's not going to, not in the context that I'm talking about, like Civil War or whatever, right? Yeah. But
there's some, this is a tangent and we should probably avoid it, but there's some interesting things about this kind of use of music language in James Cameron's Avatar that I would love to hear your thoughts on someday, given
let's do that on a different
I know nothing about it, but I
love talking about that stuff, and I don't get to talk about it quite as much. But my point is, there is a right and a wrong way to convey certain ideas. Like if I want you to feel like you're in India or in Jamaica or whatever, there are different techniques you can use. The postmodernist thing that benefited me as a composer is that I'm not limited to saying I'm an American making American music, therefore it's got to all sound like Aaron Copland, and that's literally it. That's all I can do. It says I can pull from whatever I want, wherever I want, and use it however I want, but it doesn't absolve me of understanding the reality of how an audience is going to receive it.
Yeah.
If I rejected that, then I would be rejecting the metaphysical aspects of it. I'd be saying reality isn't real. Anything's what I want to make it. I'll tell you that this clearly Jamaican music is actually, Massachusetts jazz or something. And you go, that doesn't make any sense, right? Mm-hmm. None of that scans, because it's not real, and reality is real. And there are things that objectively make sense or don't make sense. But postmodernism breaks that apart, especially when you get into philosophy and law and politics, and you start influencing, education and everything there. You're starting to say that nothing is true. Nothing matters. Everything is just a matter of, getting into the critical theory side of it. Nothing is anything except for class struggle or, some kind of hierarchy that we're trying to battle our way up. And so whatever is true is
power
just
relationships,
somebody in power, right? Yeah. That is, and it's funny to me because it is a little bit live by the sword, die by the sword kind of a problem, because absolutely. When you say that nothing is actually true, and then you throw that out there for years and years and years on social media, you shouldn't be that surprised that a lot of people don't believe what you're saying.
Yeah. Objectivity is one of the hardest things that I have to teach my students, because it's so pounded out of them for so much of their early education that it winds up being a lot of work to reintroduce them to what I think we can agree should be pretty obvious, just given the way we interact with things when we're not in that kind of mindset.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, you've got to go, so thank you again. Thank you so much for coming by, and happy Thanksgiving as well to you and yours.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving to you too. Thanks.
Awesome. Anything you want to plug at the end? You were mentioning the next episode of Out of Frame coming up.
Sure. Out of Frame on YouTube. You can just search for it, or it's youtube.com/Fee Online. We also have a podcast for Out of Frame. It's called Behind the Scenes. I actually just got done recording a couple new episodes of that this afternoon.
Forward to it.
And then we have some relatively new social channels. We've got Twitter and Instagram. It's Out of Frame Fee on both of those channels, but we're just kind of getting into supporting those with more of, more social media, more stuff like that on the platforms, and trying to get a little bit better at that kind of stuff. But otherwise, yeah, just fee.org, check that out.
And you'll find fee.org and the Fee YouTube channel in the description already. And let me know if there's anything else you want me to throw in there once this goes up for everybody, and I'll happy to do it. Sure. Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again for stopping by, and that's for tonight.
All right.
Fantastic.
Have a great night.
Good talking to you.